I'm going to talk about the hope list, new therapies for Parkinson's, from the perspective of somebody with Parkinson's. I'm going to talk about the numbers of trials that are underway, why they're in progress, and select some areas that I find particularly exciting. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. Originally PhD biochemist, worked in research products with Amersham. I was head of R&D for diagnostics at Serono, head of R&D for pharmaceuticals and health and personal care at Reckitt Benckiser. Now, you might not have heard of Reckitt Benckiser, but hopefully you'll recognize some of the brands that are on this chart. Now, the other one to highlight on this chart is Suboxone. You've heard the word repurpose several times already today. And way back in the 1980s, early 90s, Temgesic, which some of you may have heard of, was a small partial opiate agonist used for pain relief, selling about £10 million a year. And together with the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, we took buprenorphine into a higher dose, combined it with naloxone, and produced what is now the world's leading treatment for opioid use dependence. And the spin-off company that produced that, Indivior, had sales last year of $800 million. So a very good, fantastic success rate for patients as well, because this is much better than methadone and any of the alternative treatments. Now, I should also explain that I'm not an expert in Parkinson's like Richard or Camille, but if you have a stinking cold, if you've got severe constipation, a blinding headache, terrible mouth ulcers, raging reflux, and you try to hide your opioid use dependence, and you still want smooth legs, see me afterwards. So, just to reiterate some of the things you've heard of, why are companies interested in Parkinson's? There's a lot of us about, and there will be even more of us about. And the rate of increase in the incidence of Parkinson's is not just the population getting older. The incidence of Parkinson's is increasing at a rate higher than would be explained by the population getting older. It's a chronic condition. It doesn't yet go away. And still, it's primarily a disease of old age, or at least older people. We know 1 in 20 people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's are below 40, but still predominantly older. And I put the word cure into inverted commas here, and I'll explain a bit more. I'm sure a lot of you understand why it's not as simple as saying we can cure Parkinson's. It's a bit more complicated than that. So when I was diagnosed, with my scientific background, I started to try and find out as much as possible about Parkinson's. And that included getting a list of therapies that were in development for Parkinson's, just to try and find out what was on the horizon. Obviously, hoping that at some point there will be something that you could call a cure. With a disordered list, I thought that's not very practical. So I decided to try and put some order into it, to organize it into a spreadsheet. And pretty much became a bit of an obsession. So next time I see my consultant, who some of you know, who is called Dr. Who, I'll have to tell her that maybe when you ask me the question about impulse control disorders, I might actually have one. I'd rather call it an obsession. So for those of you who've read the information that was circulated previously, you'll know the answer to this question. And I think it's a very impressive 264. And yes, I can read. It's just that I've discovered another one since I sent the presentation into Jackie and Helen. And that's why the asterisk is there as well, because we're always finding out more and more studies that we don't know about. And small companies quite often doing research programs on novel ways to try and provide ways to modify the course of progression of Parkinson's. Now, there's 3 ways that you can look at this. Is it trying to relieve the symptoms that we have of Parkinson's? Is it trying to stop the progress of the disease? Or is it trying to replace what's been lost? And if you can slow down the course of the disease or replace what's been lost, that's what you call disease modifying. So of the 263 that are in this current count, you've got 88 that are looking to relieve symptoms and 175 trying to slow the course of the disease or replace what's been lost. And just to remind you what all of these therapies have to go through. So pre-discovery, where you try and find out what's happening with a particular disease target. Then look at drugs, trying to discover molecules that will actually address that target. Prove that they're safe in preclinical models. You get some level of effect in models. The MTPT model of Parkinson's, the 6-hydroxydopamine model of Parkinson's. That takes quite a while when you're doing the basic science. Then you might have enough data to prove to the regulatory authorities that you can actually go into people, real parkies, in phase 1, primarily around safety, phase 2, confirming safety, looking at dose ranging, getting first reading out of efficacy, phase 3, big numbers proving your efficacy. And then you can say, right, we're going to submit a new drug application to the FDA, the MHRA, EMA, and they'll say, yay, approved. You can go and sell it and start treating real patients. But this obviously varies by indication, but the average is you need to look at roughly between 5,000 and 10,000 compounds at that stage to reach one approved drug there. So it's long drawn out, very expensive, and from a patient perspective, immensely frustrating. So, where are the therapies by phase? And I won't go through the detailed numbers, but just to point out a couple of things. There's a couple of big spikes in preclinical and phase 2. And unfortunately, not many of these, not many phase 3, not many registration. And of the 15 in phase 3 at the moment, there are only 3 that are looking at disease modifying. The rest are looking to relieve symptoms. That's not to decry improved symptom relief. We all need it. But it would be nice to see more disease-modifying therapies moving faster through the phases and getting to phase 3. There's also a wonderful website called pdtrialtracker.info, set up by Sue Buff and Gary Refaloff in the US. And that's taken all of the clinical trial information that's on clinicaltrials.gov. Does everybody know about clinicaltrials.gov? Yeah? Sue's built some algorithms which take the information in clinicaltrials.gov and transform it into an easy-read website so you can look at how many are in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, look at which ones are where. And this number there differs from my number because there are multiple trials for each therapy. Some trials are double counted, so if they're down as a phase 1 stroke 2, they're classified as both phase 1 and phase 2. There are some observational trials here, there's some mechanistic studies, and also there are some diagnostic studies underway as well. So mine focuses on the therapies, and that's the primary source of hope as well. So, what's happening to look at relieving symptoms? So there are projects like the so-called accordion pill, which when you swallow it, expands in the stomach, doesn't pass out the stomach, but then slowly releases dopamine on a more even track than the pulsatile track that you get through taking Madapar every 3 or 4 hours. So trying to avoid the peaks and troughs, because obviously the more pulsatile intake you have, the more dyskinesia you get, the more off periods you get at the bottom of the trough as well. And if the dopaminergic system isn't working, are there other systems through NMDA, GABA, etc.? Are there other therapies that can get around the existing neuronal roadblocks to find another route towards the relief of symptoms? Then there are lots of studies looking at relieving specific symptoms like dyskinesia, like psychosis, etc. And you can see the list here. And as practitioners, those will be symptoms that you're all familiar with when you see Parkinson's patients in the clinic. Now, also, how do you slow disease progress down? There are ways of targeting the main culprits. Proteins like alpha-synuclein, the GBA gene which produces glucocerebrosidase, which Richard mentioned, LRRK2, and for those conditions where mitochondria are not working as well as they should be. Also, once you know that someone has a genetic cause of Parkinson's, like a GBA mutation, you can select those groups and look at specifically targeting the dysfunction in glucocerebrosidase, which actually leads to lysosomal storage problems, so you can't get rid of the cellular rubbish like you normally should do. What's interesting there, there's a very good example with a US company called Denali, who've got some early clinical phase work on a LRRK2 inhibitor, which is originally targeted towards people with a genetic mutation in the LRRK2 gene. And what they believe now is that is going to be relevant for people who have idiopathic Parkinson's as well. So it's not only just targeted for the people with that mutation, it potentially has broader applicability, which we all welcome. So if you're going to slow the disease down and you stabilize it, for example, and I, for one, would be happy if my disease would not progress any further. I could take it living like I am now. But then there'll probably be a need to protect what remains behind. I mean, I don't know what percentage of my dopaminergic neurons and my substantia nigras that I've lost. But whatever it is now, I'll take it. And there's always a debate over whether you're trying to slow the progress down, trying to stop it, or even reverse it. And talking about reversing the disease progress comes down to replacing what's lost. And there's two main areas where we're trying to replace what's already been lost in our brains. And that's stem cells. A lot of the early work was done with embryonic stem cells. And the main target now is for induced pluripotent stem cells. And the other approach is gene therapy. And what's happening here is companies like Axovant and Voyager are trying to inject the code for making certain enzymes into striatum, not just the substantia nigra, so that you get activity of things like amino acid decarboxylase or tyrosine hydroxylase, where it's been lost. Now, neither of these may be classified as absolutely curing completely all the problems with Parkinson's, because we know it's not just substantia nigra. We know there are other parts of the system that go wrong as well. And equally, the source of the problem, if it's, for example, alpha-synuclein polymerization, that may still be happening. So there may still be a need for neuroprotection. And as Richard explained earlier, we're not necessarily looking for one medication which does all of these things. We might have to look at combinations as well. So, back to repurposing. There are some really smart projects on the way for repurposing. And I've just listed here some of the existing indications of the drugs that are being repurposed towards Parkinson's. So everything from cough relief to high blood pressure, cholesterol lowering, the PD stat trial that Camille's leading. And there's some very, very smart thinking underway. It's very smart research to look at how you can actually translate something that has already been through safety in one indication into Parkinson's as the next indication. And when you look at in each of the three areas, the kind of objectives that people are trying to achieve, so faster acting dopamine. So there's a inhaled levodopa, a brand called Inbrija, which is currently with FDA at the moment, and hopefully will be launched in the US in early 2019, which starts to work within 10 minutes. So one of the classic Parky problems of trying to get out of bed in the morning, so a lot of your patients, as you know, will get up early, take a medication, go back to bed, and get up properly once the medication has started to take effect. This could make a significant difference to that part of a Parkinson's person's day. Longer lasting, with smoother blood levels, less dyskinesia, which as those of us on levodopa get older, take levodopa for longer, becomes more of a challenge. Immunotherapy, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. Correcting problems where mitochondria are either not working properly or dead mitochondria aren't being disposed of properly is also a problem in Parkinson's. And I mentioned targeting the nasties and stem cells and gene therapy. I find a lot of these are really exciting opportunities and have a tremendous amount of potential. So this is just focus on one area. This is immunotherapy. And what I've done here is, this is the company, the project, the stage it's at, and just some numbers to give you an idea of some of the investment in these areas. So Biogen have BIIB 054, and that is a passive approach to immunotherapy, which means it's an antibody itself that's injected into the patient, and that has its own effects. Whereas the Aphiris product, here, PDO4, that actually is active immunotherapy. It works like a vaccine, so it will stimulate an immune response within the patient to generate their own antibodies and try to solve the problem that way. So the Biogen product will probably be taken more frequently than the Aphiris products. But Biogen are a big company. They have $12 billion worth of sales. So you got Roche, you got AstraZeneca, Takeda, Lundbeck, good mid-sized player. There's a lot of infrastructural weight behind these therapies. Even with the small companies like Aphiris, they have $165 million invested in them. AC Immune, who I'd never heard of before I started this work, they have $110 million euros in cash to invest in these areas. Denali have $500 million in cash. There's a lot going into these areas. And this is just the list for immunotherapy. And here's some more examples of some of the investment that's happening in the Parkinson's area. So Lundbeck acquired a phase 2 drug from Prexon Therapeutics for $1 billion. Mitsubishi Tanabe spent $1 billion acquiring Parkinson's. In January of this year, there's a lot of people with long faces because Pfizer had announced that they were getting out of neuroscience research. But now we find that the intellectual property and the assets that Pfizer had in neuroscience have been put together with $350 million of investment from Bain Capital to form a new company called Cerevel to develop the pipeline. So there's an awful lot of money going into it, which also potentially has its downside. There's a company called, I think it was Adamas, had a molecule called tizadinant in phase 3, which at the end of 2017, the phase 3 results showed that 5 people had died on the trial, which is highly unusual for a phase 3. And even if you can explain it, even if you can say, well, it was because this patient had that problem, that patient had that problem, it is a clean drug, it's tarnished. And obviously it's a great tragedy that 5 people have died, dedicating their time and effort, as Vicky said, to a trial. But that shows the risk not just for the patients, but also for the investors as well. So to conclude, there really is a hell of a lot going on. And from a pharmaceutical company perspective, Parkinson's is an attractive market. But it isn't easy, it's not cheap, it needs a lot of dedication that you guys show, and the trialists on clinical trials show as well. Fortunately, there's some very large companies involved bringing a lot of pharmaceutical muscle to the area. And because that investment is very large, we as patients have a lot of hope. And we can accept that the odd trial doesn't work, but we can never lose infinite hope that something will come along in the future. Thank you.